All right, so this topic that we're going to be going over today is probably, as we were talking a little earlier, is one of those scary ones. Like, imagine going to bed, everything looks good in your portfolio, and then waking up to the dramatic drum roll dividend cut. Before we jump in, though, we don't do this enough, but we'd love for you, if you're enjoying the show, just subscribe to it on whatever channel you're listening to it. So we'd love for you to subscribe. So, but let's jump into this topic. You know, what causes a dividend cut?
I mean, a lot of times it can just be like the company hasn't been running their finances well, or there's kind of some structural things that are going on within the company, or you have that infamous, like, the whole market just really takes a hit.
Yeah.
And there's some kind of outlying factors there. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like, when you have, a downturn, like an '08 financial crisis or a pandemic in 2020, I feel that the only thing that's really doing is fast forwarding the inevitable.
Yeah.
Like most dividend cuts, I'm probably going to say this throughout this show. Most dividend cuts are almost seen coming. Like, we're going to talk about two examples. We're going to talk about GE and we're going to talk about Kohl's. And both of them, the writing was on the wall. With Kohl's, we were kind of in a situation in our own portfolio where we're like, we could see it, but we were like, it's in a prime position because we thought they were going to get gobbled up by Amazon.
Right.
There was just some really good positive things going on. And then the pandemic hit. And then I'd almost say we were blindsided because, you're looking at your portfolio, you're planning, you're like, timing's not right, and then all of a sudden chaos gets thrown into a blender. And you're just like, it wasn't just chaos, it was blended chaos because you're like, what? We're just worried about our own health,
Yes.
And then all of a sudden I took my eye off the situation and, off of what we were normally doing. And then the pandemic hit and then it was like, oh yeah, we're going to cut our dividend. I was like, shoot, we probably should have pulled that out of the portfolio. So before we get ahead of ourselves, let's first talk about GE and then let's talk about Kohl's. So GE, I started my career up in Michigan where, everything's automotive. And, Ford, GE or GM were really, really big. And actually GE was very big up there. Not so much because they had facilities or anything like that, just because they made a lot of parts. GE at one point was just a ginormous company.
Right.
Yeah.
And
it was like anything that electricity flowed through.
Right.
They made.
Yeah. I mean, the statistics were unbelievable. They were the OG of Amazon, right? Mm-hmm. Where Amazon seems to be doing everything right now. Well, GE back in the day, they had their hands everywhere, financially, technologically.
Yeah, they were
engines,
aerospace,
parts,
medical,
everything.
Right. Yep.
Right? Just a ginormous company. And their dividend was like a bedrock. Like if you said, way back in the day, what's the best dividend stock? Everyone would be like, GE.
Yep.
It's going to pay forever. I mean, they're just a gigantic company. And then, things started changing. You had upstarts and new companies taking over and stealing market share. And then the reality of having their hands in so many different things, caused all kinds of...
Made them less nimble. They
Right.
weren't able to change with the times as quickly as they probably wanted to because they were so big.
Yeah. By November of 2017, almost like a thief in the night, GE's like, hey, we're going to cut our dividend by 50%. And I mean, they were aristocrat, paying forever, over 25 years. I mean, a long time.
And they survived the dot-com bubble.
Yeah.
They survived '08, the housing. And then it comes into 2017 and it's totally different.
Like, hey, we're going to cut it. And then
2018 all the way.
2018, they cut it to a penny. And the reason why, you wonder, why the heck did they cut it to a penny? Why didn't they just stop paying it?
They still wanted to say that they were a dividend payer.
Right.
Well, and they wanted to keep the streak that they've consistently paid something. Yes. And then, their stock got pummeled and went down to basically, nothing. And the company really just restructured itself. And inevitably, the stock has just been on a tear. They've reinstated a healthier dividend. It's still low, but it's well over $1 now. And their stock's been up, hundreds of percent.
But whenever you go all the way down, right? Like it's easy to battle back up.
Right.
But looking at the stock now, it's somewhat attractive for different reasons, not necessarily for us, but the stock has been growing phenomenally. There's a dividend there. I think they're back to their roots with a very affordable dividend, and they're probably going to be paying for a long time to come.
It took 15 years to really right the ship to where, and they've been building to this, but they've, like you said it earlier, they have become, it's a new version of GE. Like they're a totally different company than they were in 2017 and 2018.
Well,
it's not the same because they sold off a ton of assets as well.
The takeaway for me looking at a GE is what has been or what you think always will be may not be the case. Like for a GE in how large of a company it was to get to a point where they cut their aristocrat status down to a penny a dividend, is the reality gut check of nobody's too big to fail.
That's right.
Well, and that's, again, diversification. As good as it is, you still don't want to have all your eggs in one basket in the case that something like that you think will never happen does happen. You still want to be prepared.
Yeah. So let's talk about Kohl's. This one's more near and dear to us.
We know this one.
We know this one very well. I kind of let the cat out of the bag. I think Kohl's was really affected by the Amazon, of the world where, Kohl's, they didn't have a really strong online presence. And everybody just goes to the stores, a discount, store where you can go get name brands really cheap. And then when the pandemic hit, it just made visible all the issues that they were having. And they had a very strong dividend, paying a lot, and their stock was okay, but their model was busted.
Yeah, it wasn't set up for kind of the pandemic or post-pandemic life, really.
Yeah. And I think the pandemic changed every retailer, because I think retailers now are like, okay, we have our box stores, but we also have an online presence. Everybody has to have an online presence now.
Right. And it's got to be strong.
Yes.
Like it's got to be quick, efficient. You've got to be able to get clothes or whatever you're purchasing quickly out the door. Tons of communication. And I mean, we've seen it in our own lives just over the past few months, really, like personally, about great customer service. Because when things go wrong in the shipping and then being able to have like a good return policy, like it's fascinating how different.
Well, even look how they're advertising. Look at a Dick's Sporting Goods. Like if you watch any commercials that they have on TV right now, all they talk about is their website. They're like, hey, I don't know what it was, but it's about shipping and speed and, and it just hit me as we're sitting here. I'm like, yeah, all their commercials right now, they make them funny, but they're all about stuffing arriving to your house without going in. Now they show the store and it's grander and how big it is, but they highlight the fact that you can just pull up the app and click a couple buttons and it shows up your door the next day.
You can do it easy like you can with Amazon.
They're trying to compete in that space.
Right.
And with Kohl's, they were almost caught
without anything. They had really built, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it felt like they had built their model around in-store relationships. Like they had partnered with the Nikes and Under Armours to like, hey, let us be another outlet for you. And then they did the big partnership with Sephora, like the makeup and everything to have a footprint there instead of just in a mall. And then boom. Yeah. It was like we've leveraged all this space and
I will say, you walk up to that register and every single time it's less than what you think it's going to be. So their margins may not be like they may not have. You just don't have enough to offset you not being ready to compete with the Amazons and that's
and with Kohl's they just suspended their dividend. They didn't really cut it. They were just like, hey, we're just not going to pay until further notice.
Right.
And then when they did reinstate it, they reinstated it way less.
Right.
And the takeaway here is pay attention.
Yes.
We were paying attention and we were going to cut it out of the portfolio, but then the pandemic hit it and we
just made it sped it up. Like you said, it's like, what is it? Like growth can kind of mask some of the things that are wrong with the company because you're getting all the growth. But then when a recession or a pandemic, some kind of economic event happens, and the tide goes out. I think it's either Ramsey or Buffett. They're like, when the tide goes out, you can always see who's been skinny dipping.
Yep.
And hanging out here, like we've a little too leveraged. We weren't able to be nimble during this.
So let's talk about, so how to prepare, what to pay attention to right away. So, for us, we're always paying attention to the financials, the free cash flow, all this kind of stuff. So as we do, we're always on the lookout to make sure that, hey, are we exposed in any position? And we saw Kohl's happening again.
Right.
To reiterate myself,
You're
sped it up super
a little
fast.
feedback on that.
You're slow. We've said this before. You're very patient.
Right.
And you want to make sure that things are...
You don't panic.
No one saw the pandemic coming. So it just made it sped up something.
So one of the things I'd say is, when you're building your own portfolio, have a thought process of when things like, and here's what happens. We've talked about the high yield trap before, but one thing we haven't talked about is the high yield trap that just organically happens in your own portfolio. Because you have a stock that might be paying 4%, but over a span of 3 years, it goes from 4 to 6 to 8 to 9. And you're just like, hey, this stock that we bought, their price has slowly gone down, but the yield has gone up. It's held its own. It's continuing to pay raise. We're looking at the financials, and you become almost like this, you're just emotionally attached. Not that we're emotionally attached to Kohl's, but there's just something of like, hey, how can we find a replacement? Like this stock is paying 9%. To cut this out of our portfolio is a big hole, and we have less amount of money because the stock is dipped. How can we go replace that? It's a big, tall challenge. But you have to have a strategic, like, here's our policy. Like if you're building your own portfolio, you have to be like, when the free cash flow gets here, the payout ratio gets here, or whatever, you have to have an understanding like, hey, it's on the chopping block and you have to take action. If you get blindsided, or a situation just happens in the middle of the night and you're just like, okay, I saw that company coming. I didn't make a reaction. What do you do? Okay. Like you said, you don't panic. For me, it's just, you have to step back and reassess. So for Kohl's, they got crushed. Their dividend was suspended, and their stock, because of acceleration of the 2020 pandemic, basically inside of a week, their stock plummeted like 60-some%. Right. And we're like, what are we going to do? And you can immediately sell and go chase another yield. In that case, everything went down. So if we would have moved right away, it probably wouldn't even have hurt. But we made a firm decision, hey, let's stick this out, because something in the back of my mind said something's going to happen with Amazon. It never happened. But that kept me there. And then their stock, over the coming year, 18 months, just exploded because it got crushed. The pandemic came back, tech went boom. And then everybody's like, hey, Kohl's is going to survive this. They made a lot of changes, all for the better, and their stock just exploded. They reinstated their dividend. They're in a much better position. And as a result, there was lots of growth to be made. And most of our clients got out making a good amount of profit, even though their yield got hurt in the short term.
Right.
So, sometimes the best thing you can do is just take a breath.
Yep. It's nothing, right?
And nothing.
Yeah.
And that's what we did in that situation. Other times, doesn't work out that way, where their stock just gets pummeled, their dividend gets pummeled, and then they just sit down in the valley.
Yeah.
And they don't make strategic moves to bring it back. So sometimes, and I've made that decision too, where it's like, hey, we're going to do nothing. And then a year later, you're like, okay, it's time to act because nothing's changing. Because patience isn't necessarily always the best policy.
Right.
Sometimes it's the most immediate. Sometimes acting quick is immediate. So you need to take action, but you need to take purposeful action.
Well, and sometimes the dividend cut isn't like 50% or 100% like we fully suspend it. Right. Sometimes it's just a recalibration.
Yeah.
Like we've had multiple companies either go through mergers or acquisitions, or they've sold off a portion of their business. And then in that restructuring of their business, they've adjusted their dividend. And then you got to treat it like a brand new company. Would we buy this company again, knowing everything that we know today?
Yeah.
And sometimes you may take a 10 or 15% cut on that specific company.
Well, and one thing that you always say that resonates, just being a softball player, during some of those times when you have to be patient, if you've kind of diversified and done some stuff right, you've got other players on your team that are stepping up and helping offset some of the time that you need for the patience on that. If that makes sense, I use that equation all the time, and I love that you say it. If one of the players on the team isn't quite stepping up and doing what they need to do, there's others that'll step up, and it goes back to that diversification a little bit. Don't have all your eggs in that one basket. And you can weather the storm a little bit if you've got some other players helping out.
I think just to your point, as long as you have a good solid team,
right?
You're going to have your all-star that sometimes just isn't acting like an all-star. And sometimes you have that bench player that turns into an all-star.
Right.
That's why you put together the best team that you can.
Yeah.
Right.
And when things like this happen,
Lean on each
sometimes
other.
you just leave them on the bench, and sometimes you just say, hey, we got to move on.
Yeah.
But I think it is important to pay attention to the warning signs.
Right.
We try to do the best we can. Nobody's immune to making a bad decision, us included. But I would say there are typically warning signs almost 100% of the time. I'd say 99% of the time, you're going to see cracks. You're going to see like, hey, what's going on? Like, the trends set the action. So if the trend in their stock price, the trend in their financials, typically the trend in their financials will cause a trend in their stock price, which will then unstabilize their dividend. So if you see that coming, you can get ahead of it. But as we've talked about many times, it's not always the case.
Right.
And I'd probably say the most important thing here is like learn from the lessons God allows to happen. We've learned a lot in the time we've been managing, dividend portfolios, and we are a completely different dividend manager today than we were when we first started. And we've been through all kinds of market turmoils, and sometimes the best thing that you can do is learn from your own lessons. The absolute best thing you can do is learn from other people's lessons.
That's right.
Right.
And we've learned from both. So just, pay attention to the things that aren't so obvious, and sometimes things that are super obvious. And this is probably, let's go to some takeaways, that we can leave our listeners with. My biggest one would be your emotions. I think emotions wreak havoc to the investor. We need to do like a series of shows on that, because your emotions are your worst enemy and they're your best hope.
Right.
They'll sometimes they'll protect you by not allowing you to get into something. Sometimes they crush you by not allowing you to get out of something. And your emotions can make the best decisions and help you make the worst decisions, because we're just emotional. Like as much as, even the most logical person out there will say, oh, I make every decision based on fact. Yeah, but you still feel about it.
That's right.
Like you never get away. Like, I don't care who you are. Every movie that you've ever seen, they're controlled by their emotions, no matter how logical they are, and movies are designed to resonate with people. So it's not like, oh, that's a fantasy world, unless you're watching the latest Mission Impossible, which was
no emotion in that one.
The action of that was a little too hard to believe. But I would say, if it's possible, write down, like going back to the baseball thing or the softball or whatever sport you like, have a game plan for when things get really tough.
Right.
It's halftime of the Super Bowl. The coaches are like, what was our game plan? How's it played out? What did we decide to do when we had no emotions? Because when you're in the thick of it, you're like, hey, we're halfway away from either getting crowned or losing it. I don't want to lose it. What was our game plan? And is it working? And in portfolio management, it's just as emotional, because this is like your life.
Well, and I would also say, don't hesitate to like find the sounding board or the person that you rely on, whether it's your coach or like that lead teammate, right? That captain that says, wait a minute, I know you're feeling this right now, but let me remind you of that long-term goal that you told me before these emotions kicked in. So if you try to back out of these emotions, what was the longer-term goal? And let's make sure we're keeping that in mind while these emotions are kind of winning the race in the short term.
So that's great.
I would piggyback on that, especially if you're doing it yourself and you're kind of managing your own money. Make sure you kind of have that manifesto, the reason of why that you've built what you have, why you've invested in the companies you have. And I don't think there's ever a time that you just rest and be like, hey, all right, I've picked out my 30 players. We're good.
Right.
I'm going to go on easy street for a while. It's like, I feel like you've always got to be cultivating, always be, to keep our baseball and
I like
softball.
how we stole that. That's
like,
fair.
let's go. You've got your
players
A
you're looking at.
series, your double A and your triple A, and you're moving them up through. Like, make sure you got some people that are sitting on the bench that are ready to tag in whenever the time's right.
Yeah.
And it may be at a dividend cut that kind of forces your hand to make that trade, but make sure that you're always cultivating new stocks to move in.
Good stuff. So even the scary conversations are needed. The reality behind asset management is it's a game that's ever changing and ever emotional and ever frustrating. It's like golf, and when it's good, it's good.
Never
And when
perfection.
it's bad, it's bad.
Yep.
But there's always the next hole. There's always the next stock. So hopefully you enjoyed this. I'm sure we're going to talk about this topic quite often. So God bless, and don't forget to subscribe.